"Get out of the car," he said without looking at me. "You're just the driver." It wasn't the words that stung. It was the way his hand flicked toward the curb, like brushing away a speck of lint. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, but my eyes stayed in the rear view. That's where I'd learned the truth lives. Not in what people say to your face, but in the shadow between their eyes when they think you're invisible. They only saw the cap pulled low, the jacket with its worn zipper, the hands that kept the car steady through rain, snow, and the long nights between campaign stops. But I saw everything. The whispered promises rehearsed before a camera, the deals sealed with a handshake under the table, the smiles that curled just enough to hide a knife. I knew when someone was lying before they finished their sentence, and I'd grown fluent in the quiet language of power, spoken in the rear seat while the world rushed past my window. You learn things when you're always there but never part of the picture. Who hates who owes who's about to get sold out. I'd driven senators, donors, strategists, watched them switch masks faster than a traffic light changes. I kept my mouth shut, not because I was loyal, but because I was patient. Patience is what you have when the truth has nowhere to run. I didn't correct them when they called me just the driver. I didn't remind them that before any of them had titles, I had signed the check that got this whole machine moving. That was my secret. One I'd kept so long it had started to feel like part of my skin. But sitting there, watching his profile in the glass, as he gave orders to his staff, I felt something shift. It wasn't rage, not yet. Rage burns hot and fades fast. This was colder, steadier, like the road stretching ahead, waiting. I knew the day would come when the rear view would no longer be the only place I belonged, and when it did, they wouldn't just see me. They'd have to face me. Friends, let me take a quick pause. Please write in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. It's the best way you can help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. The first thing you learn in this job is that people love doors. Big ones, heavy ones, ones they can close behind them without looking back. My job was to open them, to step aside as polished shoes and expensive suits swept past, trailing perfume or the faint bite of whiskey. Chief of staff, finance chair, policy director, they all carried their titles like armor, glancing at me the way someone glances at a coat rack. To them, I was part of the furniture, useful but forgettable. To me, they were more than names on business cards. They were landmarks on a map I'd been building in my head for years. Every handshake logged, every nervous glance filed away, every meeting that started in smiles but ended in silence, noted like a weather change before a storm. I stood in the hallways they never noticed me in, the kind lined with campaign posters and framed photos meant to look spontaneous. I saw how a promise looked in the eyes before it hardened into policy. I watched deals that could change lives reduced to bargaining chips over dessert. There's a certain coldness to politics that no speech can hide, like the draft that slips under a locked door. And there I was, holding those doors open, feeling that cold seep into my bones, but refusing to let it numb me. They told me to wait outside more times than I could count, and I did. Sometimes in rain that plastered my jacket to my skin, sometimes in heat that made the steering wheel burn my hands. Waiting didn't bother me. Waiting gave me time to listen, to memorize the cadence of their voices when they lied, to note the way a man's smile always faltered before he betrayed someone. And each time I stood there, unseen, I added another pin to my invisible map. Because one day, that map would lead me exactly where I needed to go. And when I got there, they wouldn't even realize they had given me the route. Years before the campaign signs and the flashing cameras, before anyone in a suit even knew my name, I stood in a bank office that smelled faintly of paper and desperation. The clerk slid the mortgage papers across the desk, her pen tapping like a clock I couldn't stop. The small house my wife loved, the one with the chipped white fence she painted every spring, the kitchen window where she kept her herbs growing in chipped mugs, was about to become collateral. Quiet money, the kind that doesn't make headlines or earn applause, was the only thing standing between us and a future neither of us wanted to see. She had been sick for months, her strength flickering like a light in a storm, and the treatments came with bills that piled up faster than her body could heal. I told no one, not my children, not my friends, not even the man who would later owe his career to that sacrifice. People think courage looks loud. Speeches, grand gestures, battles fought in the open. They don't see the kind that happens in the dark, at kitchen tables where the numbers don't add up. But the love does. Every signature on those papers felt like a piece of myself being traded away, yet I signed without hesitation. Because when someone you love is slipping away, you don't weigh the cost. You pay it and you pray it's enough. And that mortgage became a silent weight I carried every day. Each mile I drove for him, each handshake I watched, each smug dismissal I endured had a shadow behind it. My house, my wife's laughter, my promise to keep her safe. They thought I was patient. They thought I was humble. They never guessed that I was a man who had already bet everything on someone else's future and had learned to live with the quiet ache of wondering if it would ever come back to me. In the stillness of those long drives, I realized something. Courage isn't just doing the hard thing. It's carrying it for years without ever putting it down. He came to me in the early days, before the tailored suits, before the cameras learned his name, before the world decided he was worth listening to. Back then, he was just a man with careful eyes that weighed every word before setting it down, like a gambler counting his chips. His voice had a softness to it, a way of speaking that made you believe in things you'd almost stopped believing in. He talked about change, about decency, about the kind of politics that didn't have to leave a bitter taste in your mouth. I wanted to believe him. God help me, I did. The campaign was nothing more than a handful of volunteers, a rented office that smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee, and a dream too thin to stand without help. There were no donors yet, no big names attaching themselves to his cause, just hope scribbled on whiteboards and worn faces trying to believe it wasn't a waste of time. He said they needed seed money, enough to keep the lights on, to pay for flyers that might get tossed in the trash, to buy gas for the old sedan they used to crisscross towns no one in power cared about. I remember holding the pen, the contract on the table in front of me. It was more than I could afford to give, but I didn't think about that. I thought about my wife's voice, telling me once that a man's worth isn't in what he keeps. It's in what he's willing to risk for something bigger than himself. And so I signed. I felt the ink sink into the paper, the weight of it pressing into my chest. That pen might as well have been made of lead, because when I set it down, I knew I'd just anchored myself to his future. He thanked me, quietly, with a kind of sincerity that felt rare. I told him no one needed to know. It wasn't about recognition. I didn't want my name on banners or speeches. I wanted to see if the hope he carried could survive the ugliness of the road ahead. And as I walked out of that room, I told myself I had just done something good. I didn't know then that I'd also planted the seed of a debt he would spend years pretending didn't exist. I told him from the start. No credit, no speeches, no quiet nods in my direction when the cameras were rolling. My name would stay off the donor lists, off the records, off the lips of anyone looking to make a headline out of generosity. It wasn't humility, and it wasn't fear. It was the understanding that some things grow better in the dark. He looked at me with those careful eyes and promised to keep it that way. It's safer for you, he said, and maybe that was true. Politics has a way of making targets out of anyone who steps too close to the fire. But it wasn't safety I was after. It was something far rarer. I wanted the city I'd grown old in to finally belong to the people who woke up early and went to bed tired, who paid their taxes and kept their promises and got nothing in return but the hope that tomorrow might be better. It wasn't about me. It was never about me. I had already lived most of my life. My fight wasn't for more years. It was for better ones, for the people who'd still be here when I was gone. I thought about the neighborhoods where sidewalks crumbled like old bread, where schools cut corners until children's futures became just another budget line to erase. I thought about the veterans on the benches downtown, their medals traded for cardboard signs. I thought about my wife, who once told me that decency isn't a luxury, it's a duty. So my name stayed hidden, just as I wanted. The checks were signed in anonymous ink, the kind that moves mountains without leaving a trace of the hands that pushed. He agreed, smiling like he understood. Maybe he did then. Maybe he meant it. But I would learn in time that the longer a man lives under the weight of an unspoken debt, the more he convinces himself it was never owed. And every time I saw his face on a poster, every time I heard his voice promising change to strangers who believed him, I remembered that first signature. I remembered the ink that no one else knew about, the quiet bargain between two men, one who gave without asking, and one who took without ever looking back. The days began before the sun, thought to rise, and ended long after it had given up on the horizon. Early mornings where the cold bit at my fingers as I turned the key. Late nights when the city blurred into a wash of streetlights and shadows. Coffee was my only companion, though it was usually lukewarm by the time I remembered to drink it. I drove through rain that didn't just test the wipers, it tested my patience, my resolve, my belief that the miles meant something. There's a rhythm to the road when you've been on it long enough, a hum that seeps into your bones. It's a steady heartbeat, reminding you that as long as the wheels keep turning, you're still moving forward, even if you don't know toward what. In those endless hours, I learned them better than they knew themselves. I knew their scripts by heart, the same words recycled for different crowds, the same promises wrapped in slightly different ribbons. But more than the words, I learned the silences, the pauses too long to be casual, the way a jaw tightened when an inconvenient truth was mentioned, the way laughter softened when guilt slipped in. Those silences told me more than any speech ever could. The car became my confessional, though I was never the one speaking. They forgot I was there, as people often do when someone has mastered the art of being invisible. In their eyes, I was just the driver, a piece of background scenery, steady, quiet, unimportant. That suited me fine, because when people stop looking at you, they stop guarding themselves. And I collected those unguarded moments like coins in a jar, saving them for a day I didn't yet have a name for. Through storms, through back roads that wound like secrets no one wanted to tell, through highways that seemed to stretch forever, I kept my secret the way a man keeps a wedding vow, faithfully, fiercely, with no thought of breaking it. No one knew that the hands on the wheel belonged to the man who had given them their first breath of life as a campaign. No one knew that the miles I drove for them were built on the miles I had already given away in sacrifice. And as the odometer rolled higher, I understood something that would stay with me. The road doesn't care who you are. It only cares that you keep going. And so I did. He was new, fresh suit, sharper tie, the kind of confidence that comes from thinking the world has been waiting for you to arrive. He slid into the back seat like he was stepping onto a stage, phone in one hand, a self-satisfied smirk already in place. He started talking before the door even closed, tossing around numbers and names like poker chips, speaking of voters as if they were pawns on a board he owned. Then, mid-sentence, he glanced up, caught my eyes in the rear view, and laughed. "You're just the driver. Why are you even listening?" I didn't flinch. I didn't remind him that I had heard every conversation, every strategy, every secret uttered in this car long before his name was ever on a paycheck. I simply smiled into the mirror, small, steady, unreadable, because I'd learned something in all those miles. People who belittle the help aren't just showing you who they are. They're rehearsing how they'll treat everyone else the moment the power shifts in their favor. As he kept talking, leaning into his own cleverness, I watched the way his words cut just a little too sharp, the way his laughter rang hollow after his own jokes. I'd seen his type before. Men who think kindness is weakness, who measure worth in titles and influence, who can't imagine the hands on a steering wheel, might also be the hands that once held their future in place. They talk like they're untouchable, never realizing that the higher you stand, the easier you are to see from below, and the easier you are to watch fall. I let him have his moment, nodding when he wanted affirmation, staying quiet when he wanted to provoke. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing you're being underestimated. It's like holding a card no one knows you have, waiting for the exact moment to play it. He thought the car belonged to him, that I was just there to ferry him from one spotlight to the next. What he didn't know was that this car had carried men far more powerful than him, and it would still be here long after his smirk had worn thin. When we reached the destination, I stepped out first, opened his door, and let him pass with the same quiet respect I gave everyone. Not because he deserved it, but because my dignity didn't depend on his opinion. As he walked away, still talking, still certain of his own brilliance, I closed the door gently, like sealing a chapter. People like him never see the ending coming, but I do. I always do. It happened on a day that should have felt like a victory. The cameras had followed him into the hospital lobby, microphones catching every word as he promised the people what they'd been begging to hear: funding, resources, a lifeline for a place where beds were always full and hallways became waiting rooms. His voice was warm, steady, almost fatherly. He shook hands with nurses whose eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, posed for photos with patients who clung to the hope his words carried. I watched from the car, and for a moment I let myself believe it was real. That night, over dinner at one of the city's expensive corners, the promise dissolved into something else entirely. The table was crowded with donors, the air thick with the smell of wine and quiet negotiations. I saw the shift before I heard the words. His jaw tightening as a man in a tailored suit leaned in, his voice low and insistent. Numbers were scribbled on a napkin, a check slid across the table like a secret no one would admit to. And just like that, the hospital line item vanished from the budget plan, replaced by something shinier, something that made the right pockets heavier. No one looked in my direction, but I didn't need their eyes to feel the betrayal. I'd driven him to every corner of the city, listened to him rehearse his speeches in the back seat, heard the conviction in his tone when he spoke of serving the people. I had believed, at least enough to think he might be different, but there, in the golden light of a private dining room, I watched his soul loosen, one handshake at a time. The ride back was silent. He stared out the window as if the city had turned its back on him, though I knew it was the other way around. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they needed to, and for the first time it felt unclean, like I was steering not just a car, but a man away from the truth he once claimed to serve. Every turn of the tires sounded louder in my head, a drumbeat of disillusionment I couldn't ignore. In the rear view, I caught his reflection. Calm, composed, already wearing the mask he'd show the public tomorrow. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. The man I had once believed in was gone. What sat behind me now was just the shell of a promise, polished for the cameras, hollow where it mattered most. The house was warm with the smell of cake and coffee, the kind of comfort that made the walls feel closer in a good way. My daughter sat at the head of the table, her eyes bright, cheeks flushed from the attention. She'd always been my pride, though I didn't say it enough. Around her, laughter rose and fell like the tide, until my son-in-law leaned back in his chair, smirking, and said, "Well, you know your dad never aimed higher. He's always just been steady." It was meant as a joke, light enough to slip past most ears, but it didn't slip past mine. I saw my girl's smile falter, just a flicker, but enough to tell me she'd heard the sting in it too. She tried to smooth it over, nudging the conversation to safer ground. But the words had already settled in the room like dust you couldn't quite see, but could feel. I kissed her head as I stood, collecting empty plates, my voice quiet enough that only she could hear me wish her a happy birthday again. Dignity doesn't argue. It doesn't raise its voice to match the one that tries to diminish it. Dignity endures. It stands like an old oak in a storm, letting the wind whip around it without bending. That's what I told myself as I carried the dishes to the sink, the laughter resuming behind me as if nothing had happened. But inside, something was shifting. A slow, steady awakening, like a man realizing he's been sitting for too long and feeling the need to stand. I'd built a life around silence, not the empty kind, but the purposeful kind. I had learned to let people underestimate me, to wear invisibility like a second skin. But in that moment, watching my daughter pretend not to be hurt on her own birthday, I felt the old patience give way to something sharper. It wasn't anger, though anger was there, simmering under the surface. It was the understanding that my silence didn't just protect me, it let others think they were right about me. As the candles burned low and the room filled with the easy comfort of family talk, I stood at the kitchen window looking out into the dark. I could see my own reflection in the glass, older now, lines carved deeper, eyes still steady but carrying more than they should. And in that reflection, I saw the truth I'd been avoiding. There comes a time when enduring isn't enough. There comes a time when a man has to stand, not for himself, but for the people who believe in him quietly, even when the rest of the room does not. And I knew that time was coming for me. The call came in the middle of the afternoon, the kind of hour when the day feels harmless, when nothing bad should happen. The voice on the other end was polite, almost apologetic, but numbers have no mercy. The bank was calling about an adjustment, an interest change, a shift in the payment schedule. Harmless words to anyone else, but to me, they landed like an accusation. Numbers don't lie, but they do accuse. They remind you of every choice you made, every gamble you took, and they don't care whether those choices were noble or foolish. I hung up and went to the old drawer in the hallway, the one that stuck if you didn't pull it just right. Inside was the folder, faded, edges frayed from years of being moved, but never opened. I had kept it untouched all this time, as if not looking at it would keep the weight from settling deeper into my chest. But that day, I laid it on the table and flipped it open. There it was, the wire confirmation, the transfer that had started everything. My handwriting on the signature line, slightly unsteady, but unmistakably mine. I could almost feel the pen again, the way it had dragged across the paper that day, heavy with the weight of what I was giving up. My wife came in quietly, her steps slow but steady. She didn't ask what it was. She already knew. Her fingers, thinner now, traced the ink like it was something sacred. The paper was cool under her touch, but her voice was warm when she whispered, "Make it mean something." It wasn't a plea, it was a command dressed as hope. She'd been there when I made the decision. She'd been there for the nights when the mortgage felt like a chain, and the house we loved no longer felt entirely ours. She had watched me give without asking for anything back, and she had never once complained. But in that moment, I heard the weight in her voice. It wasn't about the money. Not anymore. It was about the years we had carried this quiet debt, the sacrifices we had folded into the corners of our lives. I closed the folder and sat there with my hand over it, feeling the truth press in on me. It wasn't enough that I had given. It wasn't enough that I had been patient. If the man I had helped wasn't going to honor the promise that began with this ink, then I would have to find a way to make it matter myself. My wife's eyes held mine, and in them I saw the same thing I felt in my chest. The time for silence was running out. It happened so quickly that, to anyone watching from the outside, it looked like luck. The front-runner in the race stumbled. Scandal, poor judgment, the kind of mistake that makes headlines scream for weeks. My candidate seized the moment, stepping into the light as if he'd been destined for it all along. The press called it a miracle, a comeback story born from the people's will. He called it a grassroots swell, smiling into the cameras like the city itself had risen to lift him. But I knew better. I knew whose grass it was, whose roots had held steady when the ground threatened to give way. That moment, the one that should have been the turning point for him, was built on the day I'd signed my name in anonymous ink. It was the seed I had planted years ago, the money that had kept the lights on and the phones ringing when no one else believed in him. Yet in every interview, in every polished speech, my existence vanished. There was no mention of the risk taken in a quiet bank office, no acknowledgement of the nights I'd driven him to rallies in half-empty halls, the tires humming over miles bought with my mortgage. One night, after another round of interviews and a private celebration that smelled of expensive wine, we sat in the car. He loosened his tie, exhaled like a man who had just conquered something, and said, "Make sure we thank the pollster in tomorrow's statement. Couldn't have done it without him." The words hung in the air, heavy and hollow. His eyes never met mine, not in the rear view, not in the glass, not even by accident. It was as if I'd become part of the leather seat beneath him, something to be sat on but never truly seen. I kept driving, the city lights streaking past like silent witnesses. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd never asked for thanks. But something inside me knew it wasn't about gratitude anymore, it was about truth. And the truth was being rewritten in front of me, line by line, until the man I had helped stand on his feet was standing on a story that erased me entirely. As we turned onto his street, I realized I wasn't just driving him home. I was driving him further away from the man he'd once been, and in that quiet, I felt the first true spark of something dangerous. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. The kind that doesn't flare and burn out, but smolders until it's ready to light the whole thing on fire. The light turned red, but it felt like more than traffic. It felt like the road itself had decided to pause and look me in the eye. The city outside was muted, rain streaking the windshield in long, trembling lines. My hands tightened on the wheel, but instead of easing forward when the glow changed, I shifted into park. The hum of the engine was the only sound between us. I didn't plan the words. They rose up on their own, steady but heavy. "Sir," I said, my voice low enough to make him lean forward, "do you remember the first check?" It was as if someone had cracked the air in half. Silence poured into the back seat, thick, unmoving. His reflection in the rear view didn't shift, but his eyes did. They flickered just once, the way a man's do when he hears something he wishes he hadn't. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he blinked slowly, as if buying time, as if flipping through the pages of his mind to find the version of the story that suited him best. When his voice finally came, it was the polished, measured tone he used for uncomfortable questions on live television. "Let's not confuse roles," he said, the words smooth but sharp at the edges. In that moment, it wasn't the dismissal that hit me. It was the cowardice. Here was a man who could stand before thousands and speak about courage, about honor, about owing the people the truth. Yet he couldn't look at me and acknowledge the debt that had kept him afloat when the tide was against him. He chose the safety of hierarchy over the honesty of gratitude. The light turned green, but I didn't move right away. I let the pause stretch, long enough for him to feel it, long enough for the truth to hang there between us, undeniable even if unspoken. Then I shifted back into drive and eased forward, but something fundamental had changed. From that moment, I was no longer simply the driver. I was a witness, one who had just decided that the story he was selling to the world would not be the one that stood unchallenged. My patience had reached its limit. The map I'd been drawing in my head all these years suddenly had a destination, and I knew, without a shadow of doubt, that we were heading there. It was a quiet meeting, the kind that happens in places chosen for their forgettability. An old diner on the edge of the city, where the coffee tasted burnt, and the booths had seen better decades. I picked the corner seat facing the door, not because I was afraid, but because habit had taught me to watch who comes and goes. The reporter arrived late, carrying the kind of weariness you only get from spending your life digging for truths people would rather keep buried. She didn't smile much, just slid into the seat and waited. I didn't waste her time. From the worn leather bag at my side, I pulled the folder I had carried for years, the one that had lived in the dark as if sunlight might make it disappear. Inside were documents, dates, wire transfers with my signature, and notes I had kept in the margins of my mind until I finally put them on paper. Every check number, every payment date, every thread that tied the first days of his campaign to the risk I had taken. "This isn't about humiliation," I told her, my voice steady, my hands still. "It's about the record. He's selling a version of the truth that erases the people who made it possible. I'm not asking for recognition. I'm asking for correction." She flipped through the pages slowly, the kind of slow that tells you someone is reading not just for facts, but for weight. When she looked up, there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes, maybe even respect. "Do you want your name on this?" she asked. "Keep me anonymous," I said. "Tell the truth loud enough that it doesn't need a name." We talked for an hour, maybe more, until the coffee went cold, and the rain outside turned into a steady curtain against the windows. I told her enough to draw the map, but not so much that the story became mine alone. It wasn't mine. It belonged to the city, to the people who'd been told this was a victory born from their own will, when in truth it had been built on the quiet gamble of one man who had been told to wait outside. When we finally stood, she slid the folder into her bag as carefully as if it were something fragile. She promised nothing, but I didn't need promises. I had planted something in that meeting, and I knew the kind of things that grow when given enough light. As I stepped back into the rain, I didn't feel lighter. I felt ready, because once the truth starts moving, it doesn't stop for anyone. Election night was a spectacle, the kind of night where the air itself feels electric, humming with victory and the kind of pride that comes in champagne bottles and headline fonts. The hall was awash in light so bright it could bleach the truth clean, burn every sin sterile, make even the ugliest compromises look like noble sacrifices. The stage was dressed in banners and slogans. The crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, their cheers rising in waves that broke against the walls and rattled the glass. By then, the story had already broken. Somewhere between the speeches and the countdown clocks, the city had learned that in the earliest, most fragile days of the campaign, when hope was just a seed and the soil was dry, an unnamed working-class donor had kept the dream alive. The words anonymous and selfless had been repeated like a mantra by talking heads and anchors with polished voices. People wanted to believe in the purity of that kind of sacrifice. They wanted a face to put to it. But I stayed by the car. I stood in the cool shadow just beyond the spill of the lights, watching the stage from a distance. I could see him up there, the man I'd once believed in, his voice steady and full, delivering a speech that hit all the right notes. He spoke about resilience, about the will of the people, about standing on the shoulders of those who came before. The crowd roared, believing every word. And yet, he never said my name. Not because he'd forgotten, but because to name me would be to confess. To admit that his first step toward this night had been paid for with the risk of another man's home, another man's quiet gamble. My absence allowed him to keep the myth intact. I leaned against the hood, my hands in my pockets, feeling the bass of the cheering seep into my bones. People in the crowd craned their necks, scanning for the anonymous donor they'd read about, expecting someone to emerge from the wings into the glow of the cameras. Some even glanced toward the dark edges of the lot, as if the truth might be waiting there. But I didn't move, not because I was hiding, but because I understood something now. I didn't need the stage. The mirror was enough. I could see myself in the reflection of the car window, older, worn, still standing. I didn't need the lights to know what I'd done, and I didn't need the applause to make it real. The truth was already out there, walking on its own legs, no longer chained to my silence. And for the first time in years, I felt the balance begin to shift. He stood at the microphone, the crowd's roar still echoing in the rafters. But something about him had shifted. His jaw was tight, the kind of tightness that comes when a man is holding back words that are heavier than he planned to carry. His eyes swept the room, not in that calculated way politicians scan a crowd, but searching, as if he was looking for a way to climb out of the story he'd built for himself. And then his voice broke the hum, softer than the slogans, unsteady in a way that made even the most distracted heads lift. "Before I thank anyone else," he began, pausing just long enough for the noise to settle, "I need to thank the man who funded this campaign when it was nothing but a promise." The words didn't just fall, they landed. You could feel the ripple as they moved through the room. Heads turned, not toward the stage, but toward the edges, toward the shadows where the cameras never lingered. The reporters leaned forward, pens hovering, their eyes scanning for a movement, a step forward, a claim to the title of the man. I didn't move. I stayed by the car, the cool metal at my back, the night air brushing my face. I watched him swallow, watched him look toward the curb, watched the decision form in his shoulders before his feet even moved. And then, to the confusion of every lens and microphone, he came down the steps, past the flashing cameras, past the outstretched hands, past the people calling his name. He walked straight to me. I could see the recognition in his eyes, of the debt of the years, of the truth that had been kept quiet for too long. He stopped at my door, his voice carrying just enough to cut through the chatter. "Thank you," he said. Not the polished thank you of politics, but the raw kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience but chooses to have one, loud enough for the whole city to hear. For a moment, the noise faded. No speeches, no applause, just a pause deep enough to hold the weight of everything unsaid. I opened the door for him one last time, my hand steady, my heart heavier than it had been in years, but lighter all the same. He slid inside, and the cameras caught it. Not the handshake, not the nod, but the moment a man stepped into someone else's car with his head just a little lower. And in that hush, I finally took my seat. Not behind the wheel, but in the place I had always earned. The truth. It wasn't a seat on a stage or in a photo, but it was mine, carved from years of patience, from sacrifices no one had seen, from miles driven in faith. Quiet justice had arrived, not in a roar, but in the soft, undeniable sound of a door closing and a story finally told.